This is Connected Games Research, a series of lectures from leading scholars from around the world who study digital games from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives. Dr. Riccardo Fassone of the University of Turin studies games from a media studies perspective as a digital humanist.
Hi, my name is Riccardo Fassone. I am an assistant professor at the University of Torino in Italy, and I want to thank the organizers of this lecture series for inviting me. It is a privilege and an honor to be able to share my research and some of my research findings with you all. Unfortunately, of course, I cannot be there in person, so I cannot take your questions after the lecture, but I'll be glad to answer any question via email. You will find my contacts in the presentation that I'm about to show. So for now, I'll just go hang out down there and let's start with the presentation. So the title of this presentation is Researching Games as Media. And I will go into more detail in a second about the reason why I chose this title. But for the moment, I just want to sort of make a short premise about the fact that I have a background in film and media studies, and I came to studying games a little later. So my understanding of game, of course, is influenced by the fact that I have studied media in general for some time, and so games to me are part of a larger media ecosystem, and I invariably end up understanding games as part of this system, not as a sort of their own specific entity necessarily. So I'll get to this in a second, but this was just a small premise. As I said, my name is Riccardo Fassone. I am an assistant professor at the University of Turin in the north of Italy. My email is there, you can write to me. My website is there, and on my website you can find most of the publications that I will be referring to, at least my publications, of course, for download or for access. So feel free to just browse if you're interested. So a bit about me. In the last year, I've been teaching a variety of subjects in my department, which is a humanities department. And my main teaching focus at the moment is video game history and theory. But I have taught and still teach to a degree media history, sort of an introductory class to media history, and the history and theory of popular and genre cinema. That would be the kind of films that are generally referred to as pop cinema or popular cinema, so not the auteur or art films, but rather the films that refer to some sort of genre, so horror, western, comedy, and stuff like that. And my research, of course, is connected with my teaching, but has sort of slight deviations in a sense. My main research focus in the last years has been the local and national video game histories, of course, with the specific focus on Italy. So I've studied the history of games in Italy, how games are produced or were produced, because we're talking about history here, and who played them, who distributed them, and so on and so forth. And this is, of course, an attempt to sort of work towards a more inclusive and comprehensive history of this medium. The histories of video games that we have had so far tend to be focusing on American video games for the most part, and tend to focus on those games that we consider to be accomplished, popular, that sold millions of copies, that are sort of the most visible in the public sphere. But I think there is a merit to researching smaller marginal histories, smaller games, and maybe less accomplished games to a degree, but games that still can tell us something about the history of the medium. Another research avenue that is quite new for me is play and historical narratives. What I mean by this is that I'm interested in how games, video games, but not just video games, also board games, deal with history, meaning how they represent or simulate historical events, for example, wars or battles or political struggles, and how games can help us sort of understand some deeper meanings in those events, or just the sort of the systems at work in those events. And so I'm studying games that are explicitly trying to represent or simulate some historical facts. For example, war games, so games about wars and battles, or political games that are sort of deal with specific political, real political events. And then my other avenue of research, I will not deal too much into this. I'm not going to too much detail on this because this is not the focus of this lecture, but is the political history of popular cinema, meaning how popular cinema sort of represents and mediates, and in certain cases influences political discourses found in a specific society at a specific time. I'm working at the moment on the history of crime films in Italy in the 1970s and how they relate to the sort of actual history of Italy in that decade. And in my spare time, I sometimes find time to do some game design with a collective called Dot 20. The website is on screen now, and we mostly do urban game design, meaning we design games that are supposed to be played in certain specific areas in cities by people, so analog games, but we've also worked on some digital projects in the past. Most of our games have some sort of tend to have or aspire at having some sort of civic value, sort of engaging people into, for example, understanding something more about the city they inhabit or the spaces they traverse every day but may not necessarily see. So our games have this kind of civic imprint to them. And also I was trained as a musician in a way, and so I still, when I have time, do some sound design and some scoring, some music compositions for independent video games. I have been working with a friend who is also a philosopher and a game designer named Stefano Gualeni on a couple of projects where I performed and recorded the music for the game. So as you can see, the recurring factor or the through line here, both in my teaching and my research, is history. I'm interested in the history of video games and media in general, specifically from the perspective of trying to expand on what we generally consider to be the history of video games. I'm interested, as I said, in local histories, smaller histories, the thing that historians call micro-histories, which means sort of oral histories, so recording interviews from people who had maybe minor parts in making something or in making some game, but that still may have some relevant information. And so my idea of media history and games history specifically is that one should try to broaden, to enlarge sort of the scope of their inquiry and sort of try to break down the canonic barriers that are sort of constituting historiography, the historiography of games at the moment, and sort of try and tell different, maybe alternative histories, and that's what I tried to do. And I will give an example of this at the end of this lecture in order to sort of try and give some actual sense to what I will present theoretically in the next few slides. So I have written 3 books, actually written 2 and edited 1. The first 2 books in this slide are Every Game is an Island. It is a book in English that was published by Bloomsbury in 2017. And it's about the endings of video games. So for example, specific notions such as game over that are very, very peculiar to video games, there's no game over in cinema or in TV, are sort of the subject of this book. But again, although I sort of deal with subjects that are very much related to video games, I try to do so from a perspective of media studies, of sort of trying to figure out how games relate to other media in this specific sector or in this specific area. The other book that you can see in the middle here It's called Cinema e Videogiochi, and it's in Italian. It translates to cinema and video games, and it's a book about the relations between cinema and video games. Again, my interest in cinema kind of emerges here, and I deal with a number of subjects from adaptation to, for example, camera movements and style that sort of is passed from cinema to video games and vice versa sometimes. And this is a short book in Italian that sort of is meant as an introduction to the subject. And finally, the last book that was published in 2020, it is an edited collection with a co-editor called Marco Benoit Carbone about the history of video games in Italy. So it's a collection of chapters written by great scholars about the history of production, of distribution, of gameplay in Italy. And again, it's sort of cooperates or sort of is a part of the project, of the historical project that I was referring to a minute ago, about sort of trying and sort of inquiring into the local marginal histories of video games. So you probably know that video games production in Italy is not, or rather Italy has never been sort of one of the main producers of video games in Italy, in the world, sorry. But still, I think there is something to be said about the history of the production of video games in Italy. So here's a more in-depth explanation of what I meant by the title and the concept of video games as media. And by the way, I have put video into brackets in order to sort of highlight the fact that I think that what I say about video games here, what I state about video games here, can be applied to games in general, analog games as well, not just digital games. And I will try and explain that in more detail in a second. But for the moment, I would suggest to keep in mind that the way I approach games here can be applied to non-digital games as well. Although the focus of this lecture is video games and digital games, I still sort of think that some of the things that I will say apply outside of the realm of the digital. So to me, saying that video games are media, which is sort of the notion that I assume when I do most of my research, is sort of the guiding principle of most of my research, means two things at the same time, and both are fundamental to me in this understanding of video games. Again, I don't assume that this definition or that this sort of working theory is valid for everybody. It is valid for me in the sense that it sort of functions as a compass for my research work. So this is sort of the notion that I take for granted when I start working on video games. So on the left here, what do I mean by video games as media? I mean a very sort of classic idea of what a medium is, or what a means of communication is. That is, a tool that is used to record, exchange, facilitate the transmission of messages. I think that through video games we do all of this. Video games are very powerful vessels or tools for transmitting messages, and even games that may seem sort of abstract or kind of devoid of narrative, they still contain messages or still ways in which designers convey messages and players sort of deal with these messages. So the sort of short version of this is that I think we communicate through games and play. We communicate. If we are designers, we communicate with the players. If we are players, we communicate with other players in the case of a multiplayer game. But we also communicate, if we are players, with the computer itself, which is, of course, not a sentient being, not a human being, but still it is a machine that in some ways is able to communicate. So there's always a communicative process going on when we play games. But on the other side, so sort of the goldish brown arrows, what I mean by video games as media is more generally that video games are objects that exist and participate in a larger media ecosystem. Meaning that, especially today, when we have platforms that distribute digital content kind of irregardless of what those contents are, and we all are on the internet where games and film and videos and music sort of coexist, video games actually are part of a system of media. So video games are linked to cinema, are linked to television, are linked to other digital content, to YouTube or to Twitch or to other streaming platforms. For example, streaming games, live streaming games, or what are called esports, so people playing games for an audience, is actually proof of the fact that video games, as I sort of synthesize in the last paragraph here, video games do not exist in isolation. Video games are part of a larger ecosystem. They participate in this. They sort of compete, but also cooperate with other media. And we can see this on the internet, where streaming services are sort of hungry for gaming content, because gaming content often brings in very good revenues. And so video games and streaming sort of cooperate here. And so I think we must think of games, or at least I think of games in these two ways. One, that games always sort of convey a message or contain a message or facilitate the transmission of a message, so they are properly a medium, but also that games participate in a larger ecosystem. They coexist with cinema, with TV, with streaming, and with the other media. So we communicate through games, and games do not exist in isolation. This is what I mean by video games as media. And again, I'd like to stress the fact that I don't think this is specific to video games, but I think this is true of games in general. Board games, analog games, there are all ways in which we communicate with each other, and they all sort of exist within a complex ecosystem that sort of goes beyond the specific medium we're talking about. Okay, so enough with the theory. Let's move to some practical examples of how I apply these concepts to my own research. I will be offering you three sort of case studies from my recent research that kind of shows my sort of my way of working and my methods. And these are three case studies that pertain to three eras, so to speak, of my research. So the first is something that I researched while working on the film and video games book that I've shown you before, so about 4 years ago. The second one is the project that I just wrapped up about the Italian video game production. And so that's a project that's very, very fresh. And the third one is a project that I'm starting right now. So this is all very new. It's just going to be a brief sort of introduction of what we're trying to achieve about the specific game called Corteo, which means demonstration or march. That it is a board game. So again, the digital versus analog sort of divide is kind of fuzzy here. That is a board game about protest marches and political marches in Italy in the 1970s. So, but let's start with the first example that I want to give you. So, let's see. This is a research project that I called Early Film to Video Game Adaptations. So I was trying to research and study the films that were adapted into video games, so video games that were produced under license from a popular movie. In sort of, I call them early film to video game adaptations because I was researching mostly video games produced between 1982 and 1993-94. So I'll explain why those dates in a second. But this was the general idea. So the question was, what kind of video games were produced in this decade that were derived from movies, and what was the sort of specific? What were the specific characteristics or features of these games, and what did they tell us about the relations between the film industry and the game industry at the time. So in order to do this research, I went to the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. This is a very large museum devoted to the history of play and games in general, not necessarily or not just digital games, that awards fellowships to researchers who want to work in their archive, because apart from being a museum, they also have a very large archive collecting books, but also games, toys, and different kinds of artifacts that pertain generally to the history of games. So I went there as a fellow researcher, and I had the chance to stay there for about 3 weeks. And this, I think, is interesting because it sort of demonstrates the sort of the relevance of archival research for game studies. Archival research is generally considered to be part of the ancient techniques used in the humanities, in literary studies, for example, in historiography and so on and so forth. But I think it has a place and a relevance also in game studies. We're starting to see archives and museums devoted to video games pop up and sort of gain traction and become more sort of rigorous in their archival practices. And so I think archives are one of the resources that game scholars can use in order to perform their tasks and their research. So I went to the Strong National Museum of Play with this idea in mind. So what kind of games are there that were adapted from movies in the 1980s and early 1990s? So why did I choose these dates? 1982 is a pivotal year in the history of video games, especially in the West, or mostly in the West, I should say, because it's the year in which we see two processes kind of crashing one into each other. The first process is a great enthusiasm for film-to-game adaptations. So we see a lot of magazines like this one, Video Gaming Illustrated, but there's a lot of them, who have movies on the covers and sort of state that movie adaptations are the future of video games. And this is all propelled by the fact that Atari had been acquired by Warner Brothers, so a large movie company, and that they were producing these adaptations, especially one that would be infamous, that is E.T., an American film of 1982 that was adapted into a video game in late 1982, but that was a giant, enormous failure and sold a lot of copies, but most of these were returned actually because the game was dysfunctional. It wasn't up to expectations, and to a degree we can say, although there are conflicting histories here, but let's say that the failure of E.T. to sort of deliver what it has promised kind of caused this other process that is usually called the video game crash. The fact that in the years 1983, 1984, the video game market kind of came to a halt and seemed for a period that video games were sort of destined to extinction. So this is the first sort of the start of our research period. And I researched up to 1994. 1994 is the year, I think, the year in which 3D technologies become pervasive in gaming with the release of the Sony PlayStation, but generally with the release of more affordable graphic processing units. And of course, the three-dimensional space kind of was a factor in the changing aesthetics of games, and games became more and more three-dimensional, and this of course influenced in a very significant way their relation with cinema and with adaptation. So this period that I chose kind of is a period that is signposted by these two events, but of course there's some larger historical things happening, but this is just to give you an idea of why I chose this period. So we might think that this period sort of is a period of crisis for video games because of the video game crash narrative. And sort of the critics of the time and and of a little later sort of tell us that in the bad old days of Commodore 64s and Spectrums, which are the two main computers that were used in that period, games based on films were notoriously bad. This is a quote from an anonymous critic at a British magazine called Edge. So I was sort of starting to work on games that were generally considered very bad. Film to games adaptation had a very bad reputation, and I must say I played hundreds of them. They were generally very bad in terms of game design and general accomplishment, but to a degree that was not what I was interested in. I was interested in figuring out whether these games had something to tell us about the relation between the game industry and the film industry at the time. And one thing that I found out is that despite all game histories talking about the years 1982 and 1983 and again 1984, 85 as sort of depression years for the video game market, sort of very, very low years, there were hundreds of video games made in those years, and some of them, I would say maybe most of them, were derived from films. We see a Bruce Lee video game, a series of games derived from horror pictures here in the middle, a game based on James Bond, a game on an older film called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So games were produced despite the crash, but these were minor games, were smaller games that had a degree of economic sustainability because they were made on the cheap, and so they didn't need to be blockbusters in order to make their money back, and are sort of understudied in game histories in general because they're considered minor games. But again, film to video games adaptation did not sort of completely disappeared during the video game crash. This is the first finding that I think was relevant. So I played literally hundreds of them. And most of them, of course, were bad, but were interesting in that they were signaling to us that there's something more to say about this period of video game history. Because one needs to look at the bigger picture. Why were games made in this period of crisis, of crash, and why were games based on films made? For a number of reasons. One is that video stores, like the one in this picture that is now, of course, out of operation, like most video stores used to sell and rent both films and games. So those would be VHS films in the early 1980s, sort of in the same premise, in the same space. So it was natural in a way that film companies were trying to market both their films and the games adaptations of their films sort of in the same place for the same kind of audience, made mostly of younger people who wanted to play games and see popular films. So one thing to take into account is that where were this sold or rented to a degree, or rent to a degree, kind of played a part in this process. And the other part of the bigger picture is that films were in the 1980s, in the late 70s and 1980s, trying to expand. Film companies were expanding their marketing strategies to sort of younger audiences by producing video games, but also toys, for example. This is a catalog from the early 1980s that shows toys based on the movie Rambo, which was very popular. And so games participated in this expansion strategy from film companies into different markets, the market of toys, of merchandise, of games. And so this kind of shows us the bigger picture of how film to games adaptations worked in the 1980s. And finally, I sort of focused in on a game called Crawl, which is a game adaptation from a movie that I think signals and shows us sort of how games adapted from movies were made generally at that time. And again, this is a game that is not particularly well made, although it has interesting things. And specifically, it's a game that I don't, to my knowledge, was never sort of addressed in game scholarship or in game history. And I thought this was an interesting case study because it showed many of the features that I came to understand by doing this research. So, what are the main findings of this research? Of course, I am sort of giving you a very compact picture of what I did. But I think the main findings are that studying notoriously bad, to use the reviewers' terms, games can lead to interesting historical counter narratives. So in sort of debunking, for example, the history of the game Crash of 1982 and 83, sorry. Then the fact that the video game industry and other media industries were always deeply intertwined. So in the early 80s, the sort of attempt of the film industry, successful attempt, I must say, of the film industry to reach a younger audience via toys, games, merchandise, kind of was deeply intertwined with the games industry. And finally, that certain underlooked games, for example, Crawl, can offer precious insights on production methods and relations with other media industries. So this was a research that I completed about 4 years ago now, and that is part of the book on films and video games that was published in Italian in 2017. As I said, in the last maybe 4 to 5 years, I have worked on the history of Italian video game production. And this resulted in the book that I've shown before and in a number of articles that you can find on my website. What I will talk about here especially can be found in an article that was published in a journal called Well Played, and you can find it. It's free online. It's an open access journal, so you can access it for free. And the sort of the theme of this article and this part of my research is trying to figure out how video game production and piracy were intertwined or sort of coexisted in 1980s Italy in the production of video games. So my idea was we often build video game histories on the basis of sort of published video games, popular video games that are legal in a way, but there's more to that. There's a history of illegal, pirated copies of clones that is very important, especially in the history of Italy. So a bit of background, a bit of context before going into the actual research. So video games really started being made in Italy in the mid-1980s by a handful of self-taught game designers who started distributing their games. So this was just essentially people, mainly young men, who would learn to program on computers such as the Commodore 64 or the Sinclair Spectrum, and moved on to making their own games. And games were generally distributed via cassette tapes, as you can see here, sold in conjunction with magazines found in news agents across the country. So this is one interesting thing about the history of video games in Italy that we probably would not have been able to discover if we weren't looking at Italy specifically, which is the fact that video games were sold not in games stores or in electronics stores, not even in computer stores, but in news agents, in newsstands across the country. This had a very specific reason, meaning that newsstands were found almost everywhere in the country, in small towns, in big cities, and so on and so forth, while electronic stores and game stores were not. They were very much were present for the most part in big cities. So one interesting bit here is that video games in Italy started being distributed in news agents, and in order to be distributed there, they were distributed along with magazines. So you would buy one of these magazines that you see on screen here, and you would get a cassette of games made by designers who were just generally very young men working from their bedrooms that had sort of taught themselves to program games. And these were, for the most part, textual or text and graphic adventures because they were relatively easy to program. And one could conceivably program one of these adventures by themselves without needing a big structure of people around them. So this process of people teaching themselves to make games in the mid-1980s, sort of starting with the early 1980s, but then actually coalescing in the mid-1980s, immediately forked into two different paths. So it took sort of a duality emerged here. On the one hand, there were a few actual software houses that were founded. So people sort of grouped into software houses, they built a company, they paid taxes, they had offices, sort of they did it the actual way or the way in which sort of generally software companies worked. So they had offices and they had computers and they sort of established some sort of economic viability for this. The most recognized of this and the most famous of this was Simulmondo. You see this logo over there, Simulmondo's logo, and on the right you see one of their games called Italy Soccer 90. And it's interesting that the sort of tagline for Simulmondo is Italian interaction for the world. I don't know if you can read it, but it's there in the logo. So kind of a sort of a light nationalist stance on game making. But of course, there were few of these, maybe 3 or 4, because the market was not huge for video games at the moment. So the economic viability of this was not necessarily there. But these software houses started, such as Simulmondo, started making games for the Italian audience that were sold mostly to Italians. And of course, they dealt with subjects ranging from national pastimes such as soccer. There's a bunch of soccer games that are produced in Italy in the late 80s and early 90s, but all the way to popular Italian comics characters, sort of local comics characters such as Dylan Dog on the left or Lupo Alberto. So on the left we have Dylan Dog, again by Simulmondo, who is a comic character that was very popular in Italy in the 80s and 90s. They tried some sort of process of exporting the character abroad, but not very successfully. And on the other end, this other comic character, this little blue guy here called Lupo Alberto, who is a blue wolf, that was produced by Idea Software. So as you can see, there's maybe 2 or 3 companies that kind of take the professionalization of these young men to the next level and sort of group them into actual developing teams. But there's just a few of them because actually the money is not necessarily there and there's no room for more than 2 or 3 companies in Italy. But on the other hand, there's the part that I'm most interested in. I mean, the part where individual programmers, again, self-taught programmers and developers started a lucrative practice of pirating foreign games, which meant that these were people that usually traveled to the UK for the most part, bought a bunch of cassettes with games on them, brought them back to Italy, figured out a way to bypass copy protection that was found on those cassettes, and made copies of it. But they did not just make copies of it, they renamed them in Italian. For example, this is the splash screen of a game, relatively famous Commodore 64 game called Attack of the Mutant Camels from 1983, a British game made in the UK. That was pirated 1 year after that, in 1984, with the title of Cammelli, which essentially means camels. But the game is actually absolutely the same game. They just renamed it, slapped a different title on it, and sold it to the Italian public as an Italian game. So piracy worked sort of in this way in Italy in the 1980s by cloning or even just repurposing, retitling foreign games. And these programmers, which at the time were called crackers or hackers, people who hacked games, were sort of the other way in which this process of professionalization went in the mid 1980s, meaning that on the one side we had actual companies that were forming, on the other side we had these sort of rogue programmers or groups of hackers in some cases that had a lucrative practice, because when they retitled these games, they would then sell them to distributors in order to sell them to the public. These were not sort of humanitarian enterprises by all means. They were actually lucrative practices. And so what happened was that pirated games were sold in newsagents, once again, as original games developed in Italy. These were the magazines that were distributing these pirated games, and each magazine would have a cassette to go with it that would contain maybe 20, in this case you see here 20 giochi actually means 20 games, 20, 15, sometimes 10 games that were for the most part pirated games. So for a long time Italy had an internal market for games that was built around some local productions, a few, as we saw, soccer games or games with comics characters, and a big influx of cloned games that the Italian audience did not know were clone games. The people buying the games had no idea that this was piracy, and this was not sort of culturally understood as piracy in a way. This was the way in which you would sell games, by, in a way, stealing games from other countries and bringing them into the market in Italy. So this process is very much typical of Italy, and it is a process that is absolutely overlooked and completely absent from most historical accounts of video games, but that I feel has some value that we need to study, although it is a process that happened on the margins or sort of in a gray zone between legal and non-legal practices. So what ended up happening is that pirated games were actually banned by law, and so a law was passed that was very strict about pirating games. And pirates, in some cases, were actually recruited and hired by the same companies they stole from. So in some cases, the pirates were stealing from Italian companies and sort of pirating the games and selling them for lower prices. But then they were actually hired from the same companies that were producing the game. So this is a picture from Simulmondo from 1987, I think. Simulmondo is the company that I showed you the games. I showed you their games in maybe 3-4 slides before this, but they're essentially the most professional, the most established company in Italy in the late 1980s. And some of these people in the photos were actually pirates that had pirated foreign and local games for a long time and then made their way back into the industry by being hired by Simulmondo. So as you can see, one of the characteristics of the Italian video game production of the 1980s is these coexistence of legal practices, sort of proto-industrial practices, and piracy as a sort of very, very widespread practice, and how these two things came to actually converge in the end. So what can be learned from this story, and how does this story relate to sort of the theoretical introduction that I made? Well, the first thing that can be said is that if we go in depth into historical research in games, which is what I try to do, we can observe different histories that are not compliant or not consistent with the heroic or epic model of video game histories that we know from general histories, where there's usually, a genius designer or genius developer who produces a very successful game, in a revolutionary manner in a way. In Italy, this did not necessarily happen. It's a much more sort of lower intensity history, with legal and illegal practices coexisting, with sort of successes and failures, and it's a way less sort of clean-cut history. And so this helps diversify the canonical grand history of video games, so to speak. And then there's the part where actually my understanding of video games as part of a media ecosystem maybe comes in handy, because in 1980s Italy, video games coexisted and profited from other media forms. So magazines, as we saw, they were sort of parasitic to magazines. They, in order to be sold in newsstands, they had to be part of a magazine package or bundle, but also comic books. So video games existed on the back of the popularity of certain comic book characters. So we can see here, studying video games also means studying the whole media system in which they exist. But also, going back to the idea of video games as means of communication, individual developers and pirates used video games as means of self-expression and self-promotion. So pirates would put their logo on their pirated games. They would change titles in order to make them more relevant to them and to their public. And self-promotion and self-expression, in the sense that making a game for a young man, for the most part, in their bedroom, was a way of sort of expressing their own interests, the things that they would like culturally. So most of these adventure games were sort of based in fantasy worlds or science fiction worlds that were relevant to the author of the game. And these people would eventually find their place within the industry. So this process of self-promotion and self-expression would eventually lead to actually being part of the official industry and being hired within the official industry. So as you can see, by studying this very small very small section of the history of Italian video games, we have seen how the themes that I highlighted before, that is video games as media, meaning that video games are part of a media ecosystem, but also that video games are means of communication, that we can see these themes at work even in this little sort of vertical slice of my own research, at least I hope. So before concluding this lecture, a very short note on my work in progress research about this game. You see the picture of the box here. This is a tabletop game, so an analog game. And again, we go back to the fact that I think in some cases it is not that necessary to distinguish between digital and analog games when doing certain kinds of research. So-called corteo. Corteo means march or demonstration, especially a political march or a political demonstration. And we are focusing, me and my research partner, Jaime Alonge, specifically on this game in a larger project of documenting games, tabletop games that had sort of political or social premises or sort of political goals, in a way, that were produced in Italy, especially in the 1970s and 80s. So again, I will just say a few words on this, because this is a very early sort of research project, and so we don't have much material yet. But we hope we will be able to finalize this in the next maybe couple of years. So this is part, as I said, of a larger research project on the representation of social and political events in board games. This is me and Jaime playing a very popular board game called Twilight Struggle during our sort of pre-research kind of playtest sessions. And so within this larger research project, we decided to focus on Corteo, which is what we call a pseudo war game. So war games are a board game that are meant to simulate famous wars or battles, sort of simulating the tactics and strategies that were used by generals and commanders on the field. This does kind of the same things with a a march or a political demonstration taking place in a Italian city of the mid-1970s. So we see there are different units on the field that represent different parts of this march, and their objective is sort of to complete this demonstration successfully. The game was developed independently by a group of political activists in the mid-1970s and was released commercially in 1980s by Mondadori, which was ironically one of Italy's largest publishers. So it's a game that started as a small sort of independent effort from a group of game designers that were also political activists, but then got picked up by a very big publisher and had a certain degree of success. So what we will use in this research project is mostly interviews with the designers who are still around and with the players, people who played it back in the day. We will also use methods of game design analysis. So we'll play the game and sort of trying to figure out how the designers tried to map certain real-life events occurring during a march or a protest to game mechanics. And it's also, we'll use sort of the history of Italy of the time to assess the relevance of wargaming in that period in Italy. So how were games, war games specifically, or pseudo-war games as this one, perceived at that time, and what role they had or they played within the general society. So this was just, of course, a short, very, very short introduction to the work that I'm doing currently. So this is all the time I got, and I hope I gave you an overview of what I do as a researcher. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the invitation again. It's a great pleasure. It's been a pleasure sort of putting this lecture together. And of course, feel free to get in touch if you want. This is my email address, again, my website. And so take care, and thank you for having me. Bye.